Good morning, Liberty. It is Wednesday morning, January 23rd, 2019. My name is Michael Boldin, broadcasting to you live as I do every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time here on the West Coast from my home office and home studio in a spare bedroom here in downtown Los Angeles. So I appreciate everyone who is joining me here today, whether you are watching live or in the archives. If it's good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever you happen to be tuning in and wherever you're watching or listening to the show, I'm very grateful for you spending some time with me today. We are going to talk about partisanship. I have talked a number of times on this show, and we've published a lot of articles on the 10th Amendment Center website, and we always come at it from the founders' perspective on the idea of factions, on how the founders saw factions as extremely dangerous to liberty, or turning a blind eye. And if you listen to my show on George Washington's farewell address from last year, I talked about how Washington warned us against turning a blind eye to even the smallest violations of the Constitution because you were in favor of the team doing it. Now, of course, he wasn't calling it Team A versus Team B. Maybe he said faction. If you were in favor of the short-term results, or you didn't want to oppose the people doing it, he said even the smallest ones were dangerous, because as soon as you turn a blind eye to somebody because you're on their team, or you like what they're doing in the short term, eventually someone's going to expand power to use it against you. Or they're going to say that these limitations on power are just a suggestion. And I think that's really how things have played out more than anything, is when you turn a blind eye to the limitations of the Constitution over and over and over, whether it's for an emergency, or people are going to die in the streets because they don't have government-enforced healthcare programs, or people are going to die in the street because there isn't more government gun control, or people are going to die in the street because the government isn't waging unconstitutional wars. Whatever it may be, there's always some kind of threat. Eventually, I mean, it should be absurd to those of us who believe in the Constitution and liberty at this point, the arguments that these people make based on fear-mongering. But sooner or later, people are going to say, well, they used this mentality for this. Why not use it for that? And as I say over and over, we can look to Justice Scalia's opinion that where the Supreme Court in Gonzalez versus Raich held that growing 6 marijuana plants in your backyard and growing them in your own home, consuming them in your own home, never buying or selling them, was somehow interstate commerce. And then the Obama administration used Scalia's argument to defend Obamacare in court in 2012 and the NFIB Sebelius versus Sebelius case. So there's a great danger, and this is just one example, and I should probably get into more and more over time, that when you turn a blind eye to one power, someone's going to use your same arguments for something else. And today I want to talk a little bit more about that, just from the partisanship viewpoint. A blogger from the Mises Institute, José Alberto Niño, has been writing for the 10th Amendment Center for a while. I really should just have a chat with him personally, because we've interacted online for a little while, and I think he's a really good guy. He writes a lot about the right to keep and bear arms. For example, he had an article recently talking about how gun control led to more power in Venezuela, for example. So he talks about these very deep philosophical things. So we're going to talk about that, and I want to tie it in to some of the founders' views on factions, because that's the terminology that they used rather than straight party voting or straight ticket voting, things like that. So before doing that, I want to say hi to some of my friends over here in the live chat and remind you that if you are watching, or whether it's live or later on or listening, whatever, give this show a like. Smash the like button, or give us a review, whether it's on iTunes or Spotify or Google Podcasts, whatever. Smash the like, leave a comment, share the link with your friends. And that really helps us spread the word, and it's building more and more subscribers, more and more viewers, more and more listeners, and that's very, very positive. I am very grateful to everyone. So hi over to EHP Training, who says it just means the crooks have no real interest in the people. Absolutely. And those of us who are helping them do that, hopefully not you and I, but people who are turning a blind eye to these violations are actually helping them in the long run. Justin Bayola says, my notification worked. That's awesome. Cool. And EHP says, I did my GML chore. I smashed. Joseph Standridge, you have the evil party and the stupid party. Whenever they get together, they do something stupid and evil. That's a Tom Woods quote. Tom, it rules. So make sure to go to Tom Woods, TOMWOODS.com. Sign up for his email newsletter, which I think is awesome. Awesome. And he does a daily podcast as well. Denver Libertarian says, hello, all, come for the plague, stay for the partisanship. Maybe it's the other way around. Come for the partisanship, get the plague. But let's get into this first article I want to cover from José Niño. José Alberto Niño. He's a Venezuelan-born American, and he does great writing on philosophical ideas of liberty. Oh, and before getting there, hi to Bob Brewer down in Tyler, Texas. I appreciate you joining us again today. And I appreciated your tweet. I didn't get to retweet it yet, but I think that was you tweeting at us yesterday about the quality of the show that you really appreciate. So I wanted to thank you for that, Bob. Or whoever, maybe someone that you're working with down there has been tweeting out a couple of things thanking us for the show. So I appreciate that very much. So let's get to Jose's article here. It's titled, Blind Partisanship is Toxic. And I titled the name of this episode, Blind Partisanship is Dangerous, because I think the toxicity is what leads to dangerous expansions of power. And that's basically what Jose gets to as well. Here's what he has to say. Partisanship is one of the illnesses plaguing the U.S. body politic. And I think it is getting worse. Tom, in his show, he used to talk about it as a low-grade civil war where you have one side bashing the other side over the head back and forth every couple of years. But I think it's on a day-to-day basis. In fact, every single day there's a new outrage which is caused by the Democrats or a new outrage that's caused by the Republicans, and everybody has to spend their time talking about it. And then a couple of days later it's over, and then there's a new outrage for everyone to yell at each other about and hate each other. And that is the divide and conquer strategy, which I'm going to point out with some great quotes from founders, from old revolutionaries, actually, and before we get going today. But Jose writes, we see this every election cycle as millions of voters cast straight ticket ballots for candidates just because of the capital letter before their name. Now, I know when Gary Johnson, the former LP presidential candidate and New Mexico governor, well, I think is a very good guy. I think he's flawed in many of his policies or his approaches and maybe some philosophy. But I've met him many times. He spoke at a nullification event. This is the only time before Ron Paul, this was the only time there was ever a person who would speak about nullification that actually ran for president. So kudos to Gary for actually joining us in doing that. He spoke at an event in Orlando, Florida, another one in Phoenix. The Phoenix event, if you listen to my show on the Southern Poverty Law Center, on my extremist files, that's the event where Gary Johnson spoke as well. So when he was running for Senate this year, and I know a lot of people didn't hear about this, he didn't do very well. But when he was running for Senate, one of the struggles was that they were trying to institute straight ticket voting. I've never done it. But from my understanding, and maybe someone can tell me who lives in a state that does this, you basically just check off Democrat or Republican or press a button, however it works, and you're not even thinking about the people you're voting for. You're voting for a party rather than individuals. Now, in my mind, they both suck in almost every situation. And that actually encourages you to vote for a lot of bad people. Break it down. Avoid voting for the bad two choices, and then pick and choose whatever one might be somewhat closely aligned on an issue that's important to you. Maybe that's a better way of doing it. I think straight party voting is really just a bad choice. And I think that's what Jose gets to here as well. He says voting records will be ignored, rationalizations and excuses will be made, bromides and how we must accept the lesser of two evils will be shoved down our throats, lather, rinse, and repeat. I mean, it's over and over and over. Every election is the most important election of our lifetime. And he says, unbeknownst to many of these zealots, their steadfast devotion to the political establishment, right or wrong, is indirectly enabling the political class's malfeasances, incentives matters in politics, and it would behoove us to recognize this. And Harry Brown, who I've mentioned on this show a number of times, he's a guy that I learned a great deal of in my transition from big government Marxist or socialist to wherever I am today. I don't even know how you classify it. But I listen to him a lot, and he said, you know, when you vote for the lesser of two evils, that guy, the George Bush or Bob Dole versus Clinton, maybe he was talking about back then, they're not saying, oh, wow, and they win. They're not saying I'm the lesser of two evils. No, they're saying 35 or 40 million people support me. And that's a ringing endorsement for everything that I talked about. Because you're not saying, well, I voted for you and here's a signing statement. And then they get to review all the signing statements of the crap that they actually oppose, or that they're saying, oh, I'm just voting for you, Mr. Trump, because I don't want Ms. Hillary, Mrs. Clinton in there. They're not seeing it as that. They're seeing it as a ringing endorsement from millions and millions of people. We're human. We're all human. Politicians are human. And of course, and that's what Jose gets into as well. He says people often believe politicians are superhuman, but deep down they are still mortals. In fact, politicians behave like Pavlovian dogs who respond to external stimuli such as pain and pleasure. So when they're getting those votes, they're getting the people showing up at rallies. When a lot of people are doing the lesser of two evils, I'm supporting this person because I'm opposing that person. So you're not really even supporting the one side or the other a lot of times. They're actually just opposing the other side. And they come up with many rationalizations. And of course, he goes into Reagan's 11th commandment. He says the 11th commandment, which Reagan popularized, states, "Thou shalt not speak ill of any fellow Republican." And he continues, since Reagan popularized this concept, a toxic environment of conformism and tolerance for preserving the status quo has emerged. Now, it was already there, but I think this actually pushed it to another level on both sides of the political spectrum. And he says, if Republicans can't be criticized for failing to live up to their campaign promises, how can their ideas become implemented? We all have to have standards. For us, the standard is the Constitution. I mean, I would think, even for those people who think the Constitution is flawed and needs to be amended, or people who hate the Constitution and don't like it, or that it's a failure, whatever your viewpoint on the Constitution, as long as the people in there are taking an oath to say, I am going to follow this thing, you'd want them to follow it. That should be the standard. There should be no other standard. It's not, do I take a conservative position on this or a liberal position on that, on a policy choice. It's, will I follow the Constitution as I take in my oath, period. And then if you don't like the Constitution, work to change it. I happen to think it's a pretty good document, and people who malign it, I think, are oftentimes confused as to what they're maligning. For example, our anarcho-capitalist friends, hardcore libertarians, ANCAPs will often tell us, cite a Lysander Spooner quote from the 19th century who says, you know, he was very much doing a lot of writing about the constitutional structure as far as like the post office and slavery and abolition and things like that. And the things that he wanted to accomplish, he wasn't able to convince people, and it didn't work. And at some point he got frustrated and he wrote, and he started to reject the Constitution. He wrote, hey, whatever you may think of it, where we are today, the Constitution has either caused it or it has failed to prevent it. So a lot of people, ANCAPs, like to tell us this and remind us of this statement, which I think I disagree with, because you can't blame words on paper for failing to do something. It's how people choose to enforce it. It's a human action. And if people don't want to follow that, if people don't want to basically require the politicians to do that, then it's never going to happen. So it's really a market response, unfortunately. But that's a whole nother show that I think would be really interesting. So we have to have standards. For me, it's the Constitution. Here at the 10th Amendment Center, it's the Constitution. And that's what Jose has to say as well. The strategy of conservatism driving the speed limit can only go so far. There are many people, I know Michael Malice often talks about this, that liberals are driving off the cliff at 85 and conservatives are driving off at the speed limit. I think there are cases to be made, especially if you look at the amount of national debt expansion that happened in the last 2 years under total Republican governance, up to almost 22 trillion, more gun control. For example, more gun control enforcement, the asset forfeiture, things like that. There's an argument to be made that sometimes it's worse because the Republicans, when they're out of power, play what they're supposed to be doing. And they act more like opposition. But when they don't have any roadblocks, they go absolutely ape. It's pretty bad. But whatever. I mean, 21 to 22 trillion, 20 to 22, when you really look at it in the big picture, is so insignificant a difference that you can't really say to me that one is only taking us to the cliff a little bit slower. The end result is they're both taking us to the cliff. Whether you can make the case that one's going slower or faster, I don't know. So you got to have standards. And Jose writes, when you start compromising and growing the size of government, it only emboldens the big government advocates on the left. He says, give the status a foot, and eventually they'll take the whole mile. And of course, we cannot just hammer on Republicans. I think, me personally, you probably hear me ripping on Republicans more often than I do the Democrats are blank. I think the Democrats are very open about being big government, about disliking the Constitution, about loving gun control, about liking deficit spending, about not wanting to oppose the Federal Reserve. But the idea of Republican is supposedly we're sold the idea that there's supposed to be small government. So I think that's probably, I haven't really put a lot of thought, but that's probably my motivation as to why I point out their flaws probably more often. And the fact that right now we're talking about mostly Republican-controlled Washington, D.C., and in the last 2 years, fully. But yes, Democrats do this partisan flip-flopping like crazy, too. And as someone who got into politics as an anti-war activist on the left, mind you, I was a socialist, a Marxist at the time when I first started doing activism, and my motivation was war. I wasn't really thinking of the economics. I just don't want to see the government waging war and garrisoning troops all around the world. I still do not. But I was very much engaged with the left. And this was when George Bush was in office, the second, George W. Bush. But soon as Obama came in, that whole opposition was just gone. And Obama actually waged war on more countries than George Bush did. He dropped more bombs than George Bush did. So the idea that the left as a general rule is anti-war is absurd. There are parts of it that are, and I know there are some that stay consistently anti-war. Counterpunch.org is far left in its economics, but you really don't see them. They're one of the kind of leftist publications that you see them hammering on the narrative of Russia, 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 Russia. Let's have a new Cold War. They're opposed to this because they are consistent, at least on the foreign policy end of the spectrum. And they're probably very consistent in their socialism, too, and their bad economics. So, I mean, if you're going to have a principle, at least be principled about it. Don't change your viewpoints based on the political team in charge. And unfortunately, so many in the mainstream do that. And Jose does not let the Democrats off the hook at all. He says, to be fair, partisanship isn't just confined to Republicans. Democrats also suffer from the same problem on issues such as drug liberalization and foreign policy. I think the marijuana issue is a great example of this. Early on, so late 90s, early 2000s, and then when I started getting more involved around 2003 and on, when I started becoming more active, everyone was thinking, oh, okay, well, the left is definitely going to be in favor of drug legalization or marijuana legalization, and the right is opposed to it. Well, when the legislation was introduced in states, they were both opposed to it. Neither of them wanted to pass it. And in fact, Vermont is finally the first state in any way that passed a full legalization measure through their state legislature. And that was a multi-year struggle because the left really isn't on board the things that people think that they're going to be on board for. So people on the right are sold the lie that Republicans believe in small government. And the fact of the matter is, when they get in power, especially in Washington, D.C., they are not small government people. And so people also are sold the lie on the state level, for example, that the Democrats will be better for marijuana legalization. But they oppose it just as much as the Republicans do. They're not in favor. And most of these things end up going to ballot measures. And I think Denver Libertarian and Heather Rossi make good points here in the chat. Denver says, indeed, pointing out constitutional abuses to those in the mainstream seems to do no good. Tribalism still rules. Yes, agreed. But we can point out how bad they are so the grassroots can open their eyes. And I think that's a better goal. Heather Rossi says they both suffer from control issues. It's just different things that they're going to control. I mean, it's Nancy Pelosi versus Rick Santorum. They have different versions of control. Santorum, very famously, I think it was in the 2012 presidential campaign, he was very anti-10th Amendment. He's like, well, you can't be too 10th Amendment. I can't remember the exact quote, but he was bad. Justin Bayola says, takes two wings for an eagle to fly, even in the wrong direction. Absolutely. Absolutely. And then Jose, in his article, he talks about the foreign policy front. Democrats have completely conformed to the D.C. foreign policy status quo. Glenn Greenwald at The Intercept. This guy is very much socialist. He's seems to be a big supporter of Ocasio-Cortez. I think I'm saying her name right. And her bold new policies, which I was listening to the Peter Schiff podcast, and he had the great response to this, because everyone keeps talking about how she's coming up with these great, bold ideas, bold new ideas. And Schiff was like, what bold new ideas? She's just recycling the socialist garbage that's failed over and over and over. Nothing's new. She's just parroting the old, and I shouldn't say parrots in such a negative way, because I have two, and they're amazing. But these aren't new ideas. And so Greenwald is very much on the left in regards to this. But he has been pointing out over and over how the Democrats in Washington, D.C. is like, how can these people be called resistance? And I remember when they were talking about the FISA, the Patriot Act extension, basically, the surveillance extension, he kept pointing out all these establishment Democrats, some of them who were calling themselves part of the resistance. They would tweet #resistance. And then they vote to extend the mass surveillance. How can you oppose Trump and then give him all this power? I mean, that's just absurd. And then on the war issue, now that Trump is trying to get the U.S. out, at least out of Syria, mind you, I think the U.S. has a military presence in well over 100 countries. I've heard as high as 170. Someone probably knows this far better than I do in the chat. If you do, I'd love to know if you got a link or anything like that. But all over the world, and he's talking about removing 2,000 troops. This is a small number compared to the entire U.S. military empire. And mind you, there's still thousands more troops. I think it was like 5,000 troops involved in the Syria operations based in Iraq, right next door. So it's not like he's just leaving it naked even. I mean, and the hysteria from both sides is just insane. The left, the supposed anti-war left, is now becoming more rabidly pro-war, just like they were when Obama was in office. But Jose points out that this has actually been their modus operandi since day one. Historically, Democrats, he writes, started conflicts such as World War I, World War II, the Korean War, and the Vietnam War, right? I mean, you're thinking about FDR, Teddy, Truman, and then Lyndon Johnson, right? Or even Kennedy, right? And he says, in present times, Democrats are now fuming over Donald Trump's decision to pull troops out of Syria. I have to remind everyone, again, it's just 2,000 troops. This is not a huge number, and people are going nuts about 2,000 troops. And they're begging for conflict with Russia. This is a far cry, he writes, from the 1960s leftists who protested the Vietnam War and the anti-war left that was present during the Bush years that I was part of, that melted away as soon as there was Barack Obama in Washington. Oh, and he writes that in the article too. He says, when Barack Obama was elected in 2008, the anti-war left did its best Houdini impression on the war issue. And this is the nature of partisan politics. And he closes out the article, and I think this is, I mean, it's a fun, nice way of putting it, but he says, ruffle feathers like your life depends on it, because our life depends on our liberty. If you think about the right to keep and bear arms, self-defense is about your life. So, yes, and it's not just that, of course. But he says ruffling feathers is essential for breaking free from the status quo. And I think of living freely, ruffling feathers is important to create the foundation where we can live more freely, and maybe a future generation can take the mantle from there. Playing according to the partisan rules, he says, is the reason why we have a bloated welfare warfare state in the first place. It's time to shake things up a bit. Absolutely. And I wrote an article early last year called Here We Go Again, Fake Tenthers Treat the Constitution Like Toilet Paper. This is right after President Trump's inauguration. I wrote it in early of, not last year, the year before now, January of 2017. And I started seeing articles in news sources where they were citing the most anti-10th Amendment people, now citing the 10th Amendment to oppose Trump's policies on immigration. All of a sudden, they're pro-10ther. There's a guy, Erwin Chemerinsky. He's the dean at UC Irvine. He's considered one of the top constitutional scholars on earth. And of course, everyone flip-flops. This guy, every time we got covered in the news, they would trot out the dean to point out how crazy we are. We were making the arguments of racists. And then all of a sudden now he's making our arguments because it fits the policies that he wants. But I wanted to cover a few quick points talking about the founders, because I think that's how we kind of tie the whole story together here. And I wrote in the article here, the founders were quite concerned about this kind of situation, flip-flopping. Many referred to it as the power of factions, warning about the dangers of one group or party controlling or dominating the government or society in general. James Madison prominently discussed this in Federalist number 10, and Hamilton wrote about it, of all things. Big government Hamilton, both of them, Hamilton and Madison, wrote about this in Federalist number 9 and number 10. If you want, like that old style writing, you definitely want to read those. Mike Meharry, for quite a long time, has been slowly working on a book that we're putting out, basically explaining the Federalist Papers in modern parlance. So that should be really interesting. I forget how far he's gotten in that, but that's something that we'll release in the coming years. But Madison wasn't the only one. In 1780, John Adams wrote this. He said, quote, "There is nothing which I dread so much as a division of the Republic into two great parties." There is nothing he dreaded more than a division of the Republic into two great parties. What do we have today? Exactly what John Adams dreaded most. Each arranged under its leader and concerting measures in opposition to each other. So, yeah, that's exactly what we're facing. It's like you've got Team A and Team B, and they have this measure, and they're doing this measure to oppose the other side. No one's talking about the Constitution. There is no foundation of the Constitution or liberty. It's only about opposing the other side. This, he says, in my humble apprehension, is to be dreaded as the greatest political evil under our Constitution. Number one, according to John Adams. Madison thought the power of war. War was to be the most dreaded. Adams thought it was faction. George Washington, also in his farewell speech, which I covered last year, he gave a dire warning about factions. And he says this. It's kind of a long quote, but I figure I'll read it before we head out today. "The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge." Because, I mean, he knew back then how it would play out. And it's, I mean, why don't we just trust these guys? They knew what they were talking about. "Sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetrated the most horrid enormities, is itself a frightful despotism. But this leads at length to a more formal and permanent despotism. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and repose in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this disposition to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty." And then I summed it up basically. This is why our work at the 10th Amendment Center focuses on the Constitution and liberty rather than politicians or personalities. Jefferson talked about this as well. This is a letter to James Madison. He says, "Factions get possession of the public council. Bribery corrupts them. Personal interests lead them astray from the general interests of their constituents, and other impediments arise so as to prove every practical man that a law of limited duration is much more manageable than one which needs a repeal." This was over and over repeated as a dire warning, not just like a bad idea, but a dire warning for the Constitution and liberty. Now, Adams thought it was the most dangerous. Others thought it was very dangerous, but there was no one saying like, no big deal. Don't worry about it. It's cool. So Justin Bayola over in the chat says, "American politics has a bad case of schizophrenic, good cop, bad cop, too many voices in their heads." Well, I think it almost, maybe there is some schizophrenia, maybe there's some narcissism, some things like that. But to me, I think it's bad foundation, bad principles. So if my principles were like, if I believe that the right approach was to support, let's think of something else. I went to Catholic school in grade school. So I was taught that the solution to everything was the Catholic Church. Now, some people agree with that. Some people don't. I disagree with that. But the idea of approaching government saying, well, we have to do what the church tells us the government says we're supposed to do. Maybe that's not a great example. Government school. I also went to government school after that, and government school taught me government was the solution to every problem. Democrats are telling us that, or like loyal, diehard Democrats are saying, well, the solution is Democrats. Republicans are telling us the solution is Republicans. If that is your foundation, then that's what you're always going to support. And you're going to oppose anything that goes against your foundation. It doesn't matter. That's why so many supposed gun rights supporters are now like, I don't really care that Trump is doing this bump stock ban, when the same people oftentimes were going absolutely nuts when Barack Obama used the same approach to try to ban M855 ammo. He did the same type of thing, changing a definition that was already on the books to fit something that he wanted to get rid of. And he wasn't able to pull it off because there was opposition. Hopefully those are good analogies. Sometimes I come up with great ones. But the point is, we have a foundation of the Constitution. The Constitution is the foundation to advance liberty. So the goal of the Constitution isn't the Constitution itself. The goal of the Constitution is to help us with a tool to advance more liberty. So before we head out today, I've got a couple of quotes talking about this divide and conquer, because the powers that be love it when people are in factions. The founders wanted to establish a system where we could have more liberty. We could call them the bad ones today, but in comparison, even the big government ones were small government compared to what we have now. And the founders were very much aware of tyrants wanting to use divide and conquer to get us fighting amongst each other. And instead of noticing where we have common ground, like, for example, I often talk trash about some of the things that the ACLU does, but I also, on issues where I believe them to be good, I am happy to work with them. Like on issues like surveillance and asset forfeiture. Why shouldn't I set aside my differences with someone? I'm happy to work with someone, it's tough, who's supporting the bump stock ban on something else if they're opposed to Obamacare. Well, okay, let's talk about the bump stock thing later. But if you're wanting to work with me to oppose Obamacare, to undermine it, to make it come to pieces as it should, then great, let's work on that and accomplish something rather than just attacking each other. Because as long as they keep us attacking each other rather than finding common ground, that's divide and conquer. And here's what Samuel Adams had to say about it in 1772. He was smarter than most of us today. Samuel Adams was writing about divide and conquer strategies all the way back in 1772. This was as Valerius Poplicola, whatever his pseudonym he was using, in the Boston Gazette on October 5th, 1772. He says, "It is in the interest of tyrants to reduce the people to ignorance and vice." He wanted us to be unaware and just caught up in other issues rather than working forward. And of course, the famous one comes from John Dickinson, the penman of the Revolution. He wrote the famous Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. He was probably the most popular writer up until about Thomas Paine's time. Many other great founders, Thomas Jefferson and others, really considered Dickinson the man in the old revolutionary days. And in his first Letter from a Farmer of Pennsylvania against the Townshend Acts in 1767, he wrote these letters from 1767 into 1768. He said this one, "To divide and thus destroy is the first political maxim in attacking those who are powerful by their union." So I hope you found this all very interesting. I hope you found it fun to listen to. I hope you found it insightful. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think a little bit. All of that is very important to me. I'm very grateful for everyone who's spent some time with me here today, whether you are leaving some comments, whether you're watching live, whether you're watching later in the archive. Thanks again to EHP Training, Justin Bayola, Joseph Standridge, Denver Libertarian, Bob Brewer, Heather Rossi. I think I got everybody that I saw in the live chat. I really appreciate you guys engaging in the conversation. If you're watching live or in the archives, if you're listening as a YouTube podcast, the reminder, all the show notes, the things that I'm talking about, and all of our archives of previous shows are over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/goodmorningliberty. Oh, hi to Woodsider as well. Thank you for being here. And of course, if you enjoy the show, you find it interesting, smash that like button, share it, subscribe, get notifications, all that good stuff. You know what to do. Spread the word. I appreciate your help. And I will see you on Friday, 9:30 a.m. Pacific time. I hope you have a great day. Thanks again for watching.